Rougemont was a quiet town, tucked between the edges of a forest that seemed older than time itself. In 1678, it looked ordinary enough, with thatched cottages and narrow streets of stone. But even in such simplicity, the air carried unease. The wind did not merely blow, it whispered. It spoke of things unseen, of shadows that lingered too long, of secrets that no villager dared name aloud. Among the people, a woman named Marguerite walked at the border of fear and fascination. Some said she healed with herbs and ancient knowledge passed down from her grandmother. Others swore she cursed those who crossed her, speaking words that lingered in the mind long after they were spoken. She lived at the edge of the forest, where the trees were dense and the fog clung to the ground like a living thing. From her small hut, smoke curled upward, carrying the sharp scent of dried herbs. Marie, a young woman of 20, knew Marguerite as she truly was, a woman who had helped her family in ways no priest or physician could. That morning, Marie hurried through the square, her basket of herbs brushing against the damp cobblestones, her eyes alert to every shadow and every tense face. The villagers whispered among themselves, casting suspicious glances toward the forest. Another child was sick, little Eloise, and her cries had echoed across the village the night before. Marie could feel the panic in the air, thick as the mist that never seemed to lift from Rougemont. She reached Marguerite's hut and knocked softly. "Come in, Marie," Marguerite's voice said, calm yet carrying a weight that made the hair on Marie's arms stand on end. "The mist carries bad tidings today." Inside, the hut was dim, lit by a handful of candles and the faint purple glow of herbs hanging from the ceiling. Jars of powders, roots, and strange liquids lined the shelves. Marguerite moved deliberately, almost ritualistically, preparing a poultice. "I heard little Eloise is worse. Her fever hasn't lifted," Marie said, her voice trembling slightly. Marguerite traced patterns in the air with her fingers. The shadows in the room flickered unnaturally. "Then we must see what the forest tells us and what the fever conceals." As Marguerite worked, the flames of the candles danced wildly, though no wind entered the room. Shadows twisted on the walls as if alive, and Marie shivered. She could hear faint whispers in the corners of her mind, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, yet were unmistakably there. Outside, the village murmured. Some villagers told stories of lights in the forest when no lantern had been lit. Some swore that Marguerite had cursed their animals, or that she had foretold death in whispers carried on the wind. The fear grew in quiet, spreading like wildfire. That night, Marguerite walked through the forest carrying little Eloise, chanting softly as she moved. A faint glow radiated from her hands, illuminating the twisted roots and fog. "It feels warm," the child whispered, her voice barely audible. Then a scream shattered the night. Marguerite's head snapped toward the darkness, eyes wide. A shadow shifted among the trees, tall, fluid, and impossible to identify. She was not alone. The forest itself seemed to watch, and something unseen moved closer. Back in the village, stories gathered around the fire in the inn. Each retelling grew darker than the last. The villagers argued quietly, afraid to anger the unknown. Some spoke of demons, some of curses, and some simply spoke of miracles they could not understand. Marie sat silently, listening, horrified as the seed of fear grew into something unstoppable. By nightfall, Marguerite stood at the edge of the forest, gazing at the flickering village lights. She whispered to herself,
or perhaps to the unseen forces. Soon they will come for me, but the forest remembers, and it will not forget. The wind rose, carrying the scent of damp leaves and smoke. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisting across the ground. An owl cried somewhere in the distance, its call piercing and strange, sounding almost like a scream. Rougemont slept uneasily that night, unaware that the whispers had only just begun.
Fear does not arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly, settling into cracks, growing where no one thinks to look. In Rougemont, it began with glances. Villagers stopped meeting each other's eyes. Conversations fell silent when footsteps approached. Doors that once stayed open during the day were now bolted shut before sunset. Mothers kept their children indoors, and fathers lingered too long by the windows at night, listening. Something had shifted, and though no one dared say her name aloud, everyone was thinking it. Marguerite. The first accusation came from a man named Etienne, a farmer whose land bordered the forest. One morning he found his cattle lying stiff in the mud, eyes clouded, mouths frozen open as if they had died screaming. No wounds, no blood, only silence. By midday the story had spread. Etienne swore he had seen Marguerite near his fields the night before, her silhouette moving between the trees, her cloak blending with the fog. Others added details they could not possibly have seen. They spoke of whispers, of glowing hands, of words spoken in a language older than prayer. By evening, the square was full. Marie stood at the edge of the gathering, her heart pounding as voices overlapped, growing sharper, angrier. She recognized many of them, people Marguerite had helped, people who had once thanked her with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes. Now they avoided Marie's gaze. Fear has a way of rewriting memory. Someone mentioned the children who cried at night. Someone else spoke of the lights in the forest. Another reminded them of the fever that had swept through the village the previous winter, taking 3 lives before dawn. Coincidence, one voice said weakly, but coincidence was no longer welcome in Rougemont. That night, Marie dreamed of the forest. She saw roots twisting like fingers, reaching upward. She heard whispers calling her name, though the voices sounded wrong, too many layered together, speaking in uneven rhythms. When she woke, her sheets were damp with sweat, and the sound of church bells echoed faintly, though it was far too early for them to ring. The next day the magistrate arrived. Mathieu was not from Rougemont. He came from a larger town, summoned by letters written in trembling hands and sealed with fear. He wore a heavy cloak and carried the weight of authority with him, a presence that silenced the square when he stepped into it. He listened. That was the most unsettling part. Mathieu did not interrupt as villagers spoke. He did not dismiss their fears or challenge their contradictions. He nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Extraordinary claims require examination, and examination requires order. The word order settled over the crowd like a promise. Marguerite was summoned the following morning. She arrived alone. No one walked beside her as she crossed the square. No one met her eyes. Her expression was unreadable, her posture straight, despite the murmurs that followed her like insects. Marie tried to step forward. A hand caught her wrist. "Don't," someone whispered, "not now." Inside the hall, the air was cold and stale.
Candles flickered along the walls, their flames bending oddly as if pulled by unseen currents. Marguerite stood before Mathieu, shackles resting loosely at her wrists, not yet fastened, but close enough to remind her of what awaited. "You are known as a healer," Mathieu began. "I am," Marguerite replied. "You are also known to wander the forest at night." "I am." Murmurs rippled through the room. "And you do not deny these things?" Marguerite lifted her gaze. For a moment, Marie thought she saw something flicker behind her eyes, fear, perhaps, or recognition. "I deny only the lies, not the truth others refuse to see." That answer unsettled them more than denial ever could. Witnesses were called. Etienne spoke of his dead cattle. A mother spoke of her child's nightmares. A man swore he had heard Marguerite speaking to something unseen beyond the tree line, her voice answering whispers that had no source. When Marie was called forward, her legs felt heavy, as if the floor itself resisted her steps. "She saved my brother," Marie said, her voice shaking but clear. "When the fever took him, when the priest could do nothing, Marguerite stayed through the night. He lived." Silence followed. Mathieu studied her carefully. "And yet," he said, "others died." Marie had no answer for that. Marguerite closed her eyes. That night, the dreams returned to Rougemont. People dreamed of water rising around their ankles, cold and black. They dreamed of voices calling their names from beneath the surface. They woke choking, convinced they had been held under by invisible hands. In Marguerite's hut, the candles went out on their own. She sat in darkness, listening. Something had been growing for a long time. She had felt it in the forest, sensed it in the silence between words. Whatever stirred now fed on fear, and Rougemont had given it plenty. By morning, the decision was made. Marguerite would face an ordeal. Not yet fire, not yet the final judgment. First, water. The river waited just beyond the village, slow-moving and deep, its surface deceptively calm. The villagers told themselves it was fair. They told themselves it was God's will. Marguerite said nothing when they came for her. Only Marie noticed her hands trembling, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Recognition.
The forest had always been there. Long before Rougemont was named, long before the first stone was laid or the first prayer spoken aloud. It watched the village grow the way soil watches roots, patiently, silently, without judgment. Marguerite had learned this as a child. Her grandmother had taken her into the woods when she was no older than 7, guiding her between the trees where the air grew cooler and the light dimmed. "Do not fear what listens," the old woman had said. "Fear only what pretends not to." They had knelt among the roots and pressed their palms to the ground. Marguerite remembered the feeling clearly, even now, the faint vibration beneath the soil, like a distant breath. "This place remembers," her grandmother whispered, "and memory is power." That memory returned as Marguerite sat alone in the magistrate's holding room, the walls damp, the ceiling low. She could hear the river in the distance, even from here, or perhaps she imagined it. The sound crept into her thoughts, steady and relentless. Water. The villagers believed water revealed truth. They believed it rejected the false and embraced the innocent. What they did not understand was that water, like the forest, remembers everything it touches.
That night, the dreams spread further. A baker woke screaming, convinced his lungs were filled with mud. A child refused to drink, claiming something stared back at him from the cup. Even Mathieu slept poorly, waking with the sense that he was being watched, not by eyes, but by something older and less precise. In the forest, torches flickered. Figures moved between the trees, cloaked and silent. They had not gathered in many years, not since the last hunger had passed. But hunger had returned. It always did. They knelt in a circle around a stone half buried in moss, its surface etched with symbols worn smooth by time. Their voices were low, uneven, speaking words that were never meant to be written down. "The village is afraid," one voice murmured. "Good," another answered. "Fear feeds the roots." They did not speak Marguerite's name. They did not need to. She had been listening all her life. In her cell, Marguerite closed her eyes and let the memories come. She remembered the first time she healed someone, a boy with a shattered leg, bones jutting at impossible angles. She had pressed herbs into the wound, whispered the words her grandmother taught her, and felt something stir beneath her hands. The leg healed. Too well. By morning, the boy stood, whole and unscarred. But his eyes had changed. He no longer dreamed, no longer laughed. Some things, once touched by the forest, never returned fully. Marguerite had learned then that healing was never free. Marie visited her just before dawn. They spoke quietly through the bars. "I tried," Marie whispered. "They won't listen anymore." Marguerite smiled sadly. "They never do once the forest starts whispering for them." "What's going to happen?" Marie asked. Marguerite hesitated. "Something that was waiting, something that believes it has been invited." Outside, the river rose slightly with the morning mist. Mathieu stood on its bank later that day, watching the current move around stones worn smooth by centuries of passage. He told himself this was justice, order, a necessary act. Yet as he watched, he thought he saw shapes moving beneath the surface, not fish, not shadows, but forms that bent the water around them unnaturally. He blinked. They were gone. By nightfall, Rougemont was silent. Too silent. No dogs barked, no owls cried. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through the trees. Marguerite felt it then, deep in her chest. The forest was no longer only listening. It was remembering her, and memory, once awakened, does not sleep again.
The morning of the ordeal arrived without sunrise. A gray pall hung over Rougemont, as if the sky itself hesitated to witness what was about to unfold. Mist crept through the streets, coiling around doorways and fences, pressing low against the ground. Even sound seemed muted, swallowed before it could travel far. The villagers gathered anyway. They came in silence, wrapped in cloaks, faces pale and drawn. Some clutched rosaries, others carried nothing at all, their hands empty but trembling. Children were kept behind doors, though many watched through cracks in shutters, eyes wide and unblinking. Marguerite was brought from her cell just after dawn. The shackles were real now, cold iron biting into her wrists. She did not resist. She did not plead. Her gaze moved slowly over the crowd, resting briefly on faces she recognized, faces that had once looked at her with gratitude, with hope. Marie forced her way forward, ignoring the hands that tried to stop her. Their eyes met. For a moment, everything else fell away. "You must not be afraid," Marguerite said softly. "I am. I'm afraid of what they'll do to you." Marguerite shook her head. "No, be afraid of what they've already done." The river lay beyond the village, wide and dark, its surface barely moving. It looked peaceful from a distance, but as they approached, the smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger. The water reflected nothing clearly, not the sky, not the trees, not the faces leaning over its edge. Mathieu stood at the bank, his expression composed, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "This is not punishment," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This is revelation." The words felt thin in the air. Marguerite was bound at the waist and ankles with rope, the knots tight and deliberate. As they secured her, Marie noticed something unsettling. The rope trembled, not from Marguerite's movement, but as if it resisted being tied. No one else seemed to notice. When they lifted Marguerite, the forest stirred. Leaves rustled, though there was no wind. The surface of the river rippled outward in perfect circles, as if something beneath had shifted its weight. Marguerite closed her eyes. The moment her body touched the water, the world changed. Cold wrapped around her instantly, deeper and heavier than she expected. Sound distorted, stretching and bending until the shouts from above became dull echoes. The water pressed against her ears, her chest, her thoughts, and beneath it all, a presence. She sank. The crowd leaned forward, breath held. For a heartbeat, 2, 3, she continued downward, the darkness thickening around her, the river swallowing her whole. Then she stopped. Something held her. Not hands, not rope. Memory. Her body rose, slowly, unnaturally, until her face broke the surface. Water streamed from her hair, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. "She floats," someone whispered. A cry rose from the crowd, sharp and panicked. "Witch!" Marie stared in horror, not at Marguerite, but at the water around her. The river was no longer still. Shadows moved beneath the surface, vast and indistinct, circling lazily as if curious. The water bulged in places, swelling outward before smoothing again, as though something large shifted below. Marguerite gasped, air burning her lungs, and opened her eyes. She saw it then, not with sight alone, but with understanding. The thing beneath the river was old, older than the village, older than the forest's outer skin. It had been fed for generations, by fear, by superstition, by whispered accusations and unspoken guilt. And now it was awake. "He walks among you," Marguerite whispered, her voice barely audible. "He knows your names." The words carried anyway. A sudden scream tore through the crowd as someone stumbled backward, claiming they felt fingers around their ankle. Another dropped to their knees, sobbing, swearing they heard their dead mother calling from the water. The rope jerked violently, not pulled by those above, but from below. Mathieu shouted for order, but his voice was lost as panic spread. The river surged suddenly, sending waves slapping against the bank, soaking boots and hems. Marguerite was dragged from the water at last, collapsing onto the mud. She coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes were open.
but they were no longer focused on the world above. The forest remembers, and it has been patient. Marie fell beside her, gripping her shoulders. Marguerite, what did you see? Marguerite's gaze shifted slowly to her. I saw what waits when we choose fear over truth. The river calmed as quickly as it had erupted, too quickly, as if satisfied. The villagers began to retreat, some crossing themselves, others refusing to look back. The certainty they had come with had fractured, splintered by something they could not name. That night, no one slept. Water dripped from ceilings where there were no leaks. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. People dreamed of standing knee-deep in rivers that rose without warning, pulling them under, while unseen voices whispered accusations they did not remember committing. And beneath Rougemont, beneath root and stone and bone, something listened and smiled.
Rougemont did not return from the river the same village. By morning, nothing was openly destroyed. No houses burned, no bodies lay in the streets. And yet something fundamental had broken. The people felt it in the way their footsteps echoed too loudly, in the way familiar paths seemed subtly wrong, as if the ground itself had shifted during the night. Water appeared where it should not. A thin stream ran across the chapel floor, though the roof was intact. Wells overflowed despite the dry season. Cups left on tables were found full by morning, the water inside dark and still, reflecting faces that lingered a moment too long before rippling away. People stopped drinking unless they had no choice. Marguerite was kept under guard, but no one dared touch her now. The rope marks still circled her wrists, angry and bruised, yet she walked without assistance, her steps steady despite what she had endured. Her presence unsettled those who passed her cell. Some swore the air grew colder near her. Others claimed they heard whispering when she slept. Marie visited whenever she could. "They're afraid," Marie said quietly one evening, sitting on the stone floor outside the cell. Marguerite nodded. Fear turns inward when it can no longer point outward. It began with small accusations. A woman accused her husband of speaking in his sleep, repeating names that belonged to the dead. A baker claimed his apprentice watched him from the doorway at night without blinking. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Doors were barred. Candles burned through the night, though sleep did not come. Mathieu tried to restore order. He issued proclamations. He threatened punishment. He reminded them of reason and law. But reason dissolves quickly once the unseen announces itself. One night a man was found standing waist-deep in the river, unmoving, staring into the current. When pulled free, he could not speak. His eyes tracked something beneath the surface long after he was dragged away. He died 2 days later. The forest answered in its own way. Trees creaked without wind. Paths shifted, leading travelers in circles until dusk. Those who ventured too far returned shaken, convinced they had heard their own voices calling to them from deeper among the roots. And in the forest's heart, the cloaked figures gathered again. They argued now. "This is too much," one said. "The village is cracking." "That is the point. The old hunger does not feed on peace." They spoke of Marguerite with caution. Some wanted her silenced. Others feared doing so would break the balance entirely. "She was meant to listen," an elder voice said, "not to bind."
But Marguerite had bound nothing. She had delayed. That truth came to her in fragments, memories resurfacing with new clarity. Her grandmother's warnings, the rituals left unfinished, the names never spoken aloud. There had always been a cost. The cult had learned to offer fear in measured doses, a whisper here, a disappearance there, enough to feed the thing beneath without letting it fully rise. But the village had changed. The old rhythms were broken, and now the hunger no longer wished to wait. The night Marie dreamed of drowning, she woke with water in her mouth. Real water. It spilled from her lips onto the floor, pooling beneath her chin. She lay there shaking, heart racing, convinced she had inhaled river water in her sleep. Across the village, others woke screaming. Mathieu woke last. He sat upright in his bed, convinced someone stood beside him. He could not see them, but he felt their presence, heavy, patient, expectant. "You wanted truth," a voice said softly, from nowhere and everywhere. "This is truth." By dawn, Mathieu knew what he had to do. Marguerite was brought before him one final time. "You knew," he said, his voice hollow. "Yes, and I tried to keep it sleeping." "Then stop it," he demanded. Marguerite met his gaze. "It doesn't stop. It moves on." That night the river rose again, and this time it did not stop at the bank.
The river did not surge like before. It crept. Water slipped silently through the lowest streets of Rougemont, thin and deliberate, seeping beneath doors, pooling around thresholds, soaking into the foundations of homes that had stood for generations. No wave announced it, no roar warned them. It simply arrived. Villagers woke to the sound of dripping, to cold touching their feet, to reflections on the ceiling where no water should have been. Some fled uphill carrying children and relics. Others froze, staring into the dark surface of the water as if waiting for something to rise and greet them. Nothing rose. That was worse. Marguerite was released at dawn. No announcement was made, no guards accompanied her. The cell door was simply opened, and Mathieu stepped aside without meeting her eyes. "You will leave," he said quietly. Marguerite nodded. Yes. Marie followed her to the forest's edge, tears streaking her face. "You're abandoning us," she whispered. Marguerite stopped. "No," she said. "I am ending what I can." The forest greeted Marguerite like an old wound reopening. Roots shifted as she passed. Leaves trembled, though the air was still. She walked to the place where grandmother had once shown her, the half-buried stone, slick with moss and memory. The cloaked figures waited. "You've broken the balance," one said. "No," replied Marguerite. "You did, long ago." They argued. They threatened, they pleaded, but Marguerite knelt and pressed her palms to the stone and spoke the name. The name was not loud, it was not shouted, it was breathed, barely more than a vibration. The forest answered immediately. The ground shuddered. Far below Rougemont something stirred, not waking fully, but shifting, withdrawing, turning its attention away from the village that had fed it too long. The river began to recede. Not at once, not cleanly. Some houses collapsed as the water withdrew, foundations hollowed by rot and memory. Fields were ruined, graves surfaced. The village survived, but it was never whole again. Marguerite was never seen in Rougemont after that day.
Some claimed she disappeared into the deeper forest. Others swore they saw her years later, walking riverbanks far from the village, warning towns that refused to listen. Marie remained. She became the keeper of stories, careful, restrained, truthful. She never spoke the name Marguerite had used. She never described exactly what waited beneath the forest or the river. Only this, that fear feeds what listens, that places remember, and that not all evil arrives with violence. Some arrive with permission. Rougemont faded. Maps changed, roads rerouted. Travelers passed nearby without knowing why they avoided the area instinctively, feeling uneasy without reason. The forest remains, so does the river, and on quiet nights, when the water is still and the mist hangs low, some swear they hear whispers beneath the surface, not calling, not threatening, remembering.
The official records of Rougemont are brief. They speak of crop failure, of flooding along an unnamed river, of families relocating for economic reasons. There is no mention of a woman named Marguerite, no transcript of a trial, no record of an ordeal. And yet, gaps remain. In the margins of church ledgers, entire years are missing. Pages were torn out carefully, not burned, as if someone wanted absence rather than destruction. A census taken 2 decades later lists fewer than half the expected households, but offers no explanation for the disappearances. One note, written in a different hand, appears beside the final entry. The land no longer keeps us. Travelers who passed near the region in later years wrote of unease. Horses refused to cross certain streams. Dogs whined and pulled back when the forest came into view. Some claimed the rivers sounded wrong at night, not louder, but deeper, as though something beneath it breathed slowly, patiently. The forest was never cleared. Attempts were made, trees were marked, axes raised, and then abandoned. Workers complained of dizziness, of hearing their names spoken from the soil. One man vanished entirely. After that, the effort ended. As for Marguerite, stories disagreed. Some said she walked east, warning villages to respect the old boundaries between fear and reverence. Others believed she drowned herself upriver, choosing silence over memory. A few whispered that she never truly left, that she became part of the forest's listening, her voice folded into the roots and water. Marie lived a long life. She never married, never left Rougemont's ruins entirely. Children from neighboring towns sometimes visited her in secret, drawn by rumors of an old woman who understood nightmares. She never taught them spells. She never spoke forbidden names. She only told them this, that fear is not harmless, that belief is a door, and that some doors once opened do not close. They wait. When Marie died, the river flooded briefly that spring, just enough to reach the edge of her home, just enough to remember her. Even now there are places where maps hesitate, places where roads bend for no reason, where water runs darker than it should, where silence feels deliberate. And if you ever stand near such a river, late at night, when the surface is still and the mist is low, listen carefully. Not for voices, for memory. This story does not ask you to believe in witches, or demons, or curses. It asks you to remember something simpler, that fear spreads faster than truth, that communities can feed darkness without ever meaning to, and that history does not always record what matters, only what survives.
If this story unsettled you, good. Some stories are meant to. You've been listening to Knox Hour, where forgotten places, erased peoples, and buried truths are allowed to speak again. If you leave now, take one thing with you. When something listens, be careful what you give it. Good night. And don't follow the whispers.